Most people walk into a retired police dog auction looking for a high-performance protector or a bargain-priced guardian. But that morning, amidst a crowd of professional handlers and ranch owners, no one noticed the small girl standing alone until she collapsed against a rusted cage, her quiet sobs cutting through the chaotic roar of the bidding war. The room fell into a stunned, uneasy silence as she pressed her forehead against the bars of a German shepherd everyone else had labeled dangerous. Who was this child? And why was she claiming the one dog the department had branded a broken liability? Stay with us. The truth behind the metal badge in her hand will leave you breathless. Before we reveal her shocking secret, hit like and subscribe. I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories of loyalty travel. The barn doors creaked, admitting a gust of cold air as little Daniela stepped inside. She was a fragile shape swallowed by a world of towering men and the heavy scent of sawdust and old hay. Her red sneakers left hesitant prints in the dust, but her eyes were fixed. In one hand she clutched a weathered photograph, in the other a silver police badge, the metal cool against her trembling skin. As she passed, the crowd parted. "That's Officer Ward's girl," someone whispered, the name John Ward, turning the room's energy from curiosity to pity. Daniela didn't want their sympathy. She didn't look at the elite K9s being sold for thousands. She was searching for a number. 220, 221, 222. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Then she saw it, cage 224. The tag was crooked, the bars rusted. Inside sat Thor, the unstable dog who had survived the blast that took her father. To the auctioneer, he was a damaged asset. To the bidders, he was a risk. But as Daniela whispered his name, the aggressive beast did something that silenced the room. He closed his eyes and leaned his weight into her small, outstretched hand. Daniela wasn't just there to bid, she was there to testify. The heavy wooden doors of the county fairgrounds barn groaned on their hinges, protesting the intrusion of the biting morning wind. As the doors swung wide, Daniela felt the sudden, overwhelming weight of the atmosphere inside. It wasn't just the temperature that changed, it was the very air itself, thick, stagnant, and vibrating with a restless, masculine energy. The scent of sawdust and old hay hit her first, followed quickly by the sharp metallic tang of urine and the heavy, musky odor of working dogs. To the men inside, it was the smell of business. To Daniela, it was the smell of the world that had stolen her father. She looked down at her red sneakers, watching as they disappeared into the layer of fine gray dust covering the floor. With every step she felt smaller. The men surrounding her were giants in waxed canvas coats and heavy leather boots, their voices a low, rumbling thunder that echoed off the high rafters. They carried themselves with a casual authority, slapping backs and comparing notes on pedigrees and bite-force statistics. To them, the creatures lining the walls were tools, precision instruments of law and order that had reached their expiration date. Daniela's hand instinctively went to her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold, jagged edge of her father's silver police badge. It was a grounding rod, the only thing keeping her from being swept away by the tide of the crowd. She felt the eyes of a few handlers drift toward her, their expressions shifting from irritation to a confused, lingering pity. A child in a denim jacket and a single tight braid didn't belong in a place where damaged goods were liquidated to the highest bidder. The hall was organized into two long rows of metal cages that seemed to stretch into the shadows of the far end. High above, fluorescent lights flickered and hummed, casting a sickly rhythmic pulse over the scene. The noise was a chaotic symphony of service, the sharp, rhythmic clanging of metal water bowls, the staccato barking of a Malinois in cage 104, and the rhythmic thud of the auctioneer's testing gavel. "Keep it moving, sweetheart," a burly man muttered, not unkindly, as he brushed past her with a clipboard. Daniela didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat felt as though it had been lined with the same sawdust that covered the floor. She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, navigating the forest of denim-clad legs and towering shoulders. She passed a golden retriever whose cage was adorned with a bright blue ribbon and a list of its accomplishments in narcotics detection. Bidders hovered there, nodding in approval, their wallets already halfway out of their pockets. Daniela didn't stop. She didn't care about the perfect dogs or the ones with the decorated service records. She was looking for the darkness. She was looking for the corner where the lights flickered the most and the air felt the coldest. As she moved deeper into the barn, the prestigious banners and clean cages began to disappear, replaced by rusted iron and silence. She reached the midpoint of the hall of service, where the elite section ended and the liabilities began. Here, the men spoke in hushed, skeptical tones and the dogs didn't bark, they watched with a wary, hollowed-out exhaustion that mirrored the ache in Daniela's own chest. Her heart began to beat against her ribs like a trapped bird as she scanned the faded plastic numbers hanging from the wire mesh. 220, 221, 222. The numbers were getting closer, but as she rounded the corner toward the back of the hall, she noticed a group of officers standing in a tight circle near a cage that sat isolated from the rest, draped in a heavy, black canvas sheet. They weren't talking about bidding, they were talking about disposal protocols and safety risks. Daniela's breath hitched. She knew that even if she found him, the system wasn't designed to give back what it had already decided was broken, and as her eyes finally landed on the rusted tag of Cage 224, she realized that someone had already placed a not-for-public-sale sign over the latch, and the man holding the keys was the same officer who had refused to look her in the eye the day of her father's funeral. The not-for-public-sale sign hung like a death warrant over the rusted latch of the cage. Daniela stood paralyzed, the silver badge in her pocket feeling like a lead weight. A few feet away, Officer Miller, a man whose neck was as thick as a tree trunk and whose heart seemed made of the same cold granite as the precinct steps, was deep in conversation with a handler. He was the one who had handed Daniela the folded flag at the cemetery, his face a mask of professional detachment. Now that same mask was turned toward the shadows of Cage 224. "It's a liability issue, Miller," the handler grumbled, tapping his clipboard against his thigh. "The dog's head isn't right since the blast. We can't put a dangerous label on a dog and then let it go to a civilian home. Insurance won't cover the bite and the department won't cover the scandal." "I know the drill," Miller replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Once the auction wraps, we'll transport him to the vet for the final sleep. It's cleaner this way. No one wants a hero that bites the hand that feeds it." The words "final sleep" pierced Daniela's chest like a shard of ice. Her father hadn't died so his partner could be discarded like a piece of faulty equipment. She felt a surge of heat beneath her skin, a fierce, desperate courage that started in her red sneakers and traveled all the way to her trembling lips. She didn't wait for an invitation. She didn't wait for the towering men to notice her. She stepped into the light of the flickering bulb directly in front of Miller. The officer froze, his eyes widening as they traveled down from the empty air to the small girl standing defiantly in his path. The silence that followed was sharp, punctuated only by the distant rhythmic chant of the auctioneer, "Going once, going twice, sold." The clock was ticking. The elite dogs were being cleared out and the cleanup crew was already moving in. "Daniela?" Miller's voice lost some of its iron edge, replaced by a flickering, uncomfortable recognition. "What are you doing here? This isn't a place for, you should be at home." "He's not a liability," Daniela said, her voice small but remarkably steady. She pulled the weathered photograph from her pocket, the one of her father laughing with his arm around a vibrant, alert Thor. "He's my father's partner. And he's the only one who knows what really happened that night." Miller looked at the photo, then at the black canvas covering the cage. "The report says he froze, Daniela. It says his trauma makes him a threat. We're doing this for his own good. You can't bid on a dog that isn't on the block." Daniela ignored him, turning instead to the cage. With a sudden, quick movement, she reached out and yanked the corner of the black canvas aside. The metal groaned and the not-for-public-sale sign clattered to the floor. The crowd nearby gasped. Several men stepped back, expecting a snarling beast to lung at the bars. But as the light hit the interior of Cage 224, there was no growl. There was no lunging. There was only a broken hero, his amber eyes narrowing against the sudden brightness. Thor didn't look like a threat, he looked like a ghost. "Thor," Daniela whispered, pressing her face close to the rusted iron. The dog's ears flickered. A low, guttural whine started deep in his chest, a sound of recognition that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the barn. Miller moved to grab her shoulder to pull her away from the danger, but he stopped dead. Thor had dragged his scarred body toward the front of the cage, and for the first time in months, the dog's tail gave a single weak thump against the hay. "He's reacting," the handler whispered, his professional cynicism cracking. "He haven't let anyone get that close without baring teeth in weeks." But the auctioneer's gavel slammed in the distance, signaling the end of the high-value lots. "That's it for the K9 veterans," the booming voice announced. "Staff, begin clearing the floor for the equipment auction." Daniela looked at Miller, her eyes brimming with tears but her jaw set in a line of pure steel. "You can't kill him yet. You haven't heard what I have to say." As the auction staff approached with heavy leashes and sedation kits, Daniela reached into her jacket and pulled out a crumpled, tear-stained envelope. A letter her mother had found hidden in her father's locker only 2 days ago. The seal was broken, but the truth inside was about to turn the entire department upside down. The rustle of the paper seemed louder than the auctioneer's gavel. As Daniela smoothed the crumpled page against the cold bars of cage 224, the circle of officers tightened, their faces shadowed by the dim rafters. Miller reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder as if to shield her from the beast inside, but Daniela didn't flinch. She cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the smell of sawdust and the low hum of the crowd. "My dad didn't write this for the department," she whispered, her eyes locked on Thor's amber gaze. "He wrote it for me. Because he knew if something went wrong, the people in this room would only see a dog that failed a mission. They wouldn't see the partner who saved his soul." As she began to read, the sounds of the auction hall faded, replaced by the ghost of a memory that had haunted the department's records for months. The official report described that night as a tactical disaster, a rain-slicked warehouse, a sudden explosion, an AK-9 that had supposedly retreated in a moment of cowardice, leaving Officer John Ward to face the blast alone. But as Daniela's voice trembled through the first lines of the letter, the air in the barn seemed to turn cold and damp, mirroring that fateful night. In the flashback of the letter's words, the sky didn't just rain, it cracked open. John and Thor had been tracking a lead into the heart of the industrial district. The warehouse was a labyrinth of rusted shipping containers and the smell of leaking chemicals. When the tripwire clicked, the world turned into a searing wall of orange flame. The department claimed Thor had turned tail and run, his unstable temperament causing him to flee the heat. But he didn't run away from the fire, Daniela read, her voice growing stronger as she looked up at Miller. He ran into it. The letter described the split second before the secondary explosion, the one that should have killed John instantly. Thor hadn't retreated. He had sensed the vibration of the second device beneath the floorboards. With a strength that defied his training, the dog had lunged not at a suspect but at his partner. He had used his own heavy fur-clad body as a living shield, pinning John into the only reinforced corner of the room just as the ceiling collapsed. The scar on Thor's shoulder wasn't a mark of failure. It was the place where a falling steel beam had nearly severed his limb while he refused to move, keeping John shielded beneath him until the smoke cleared. Thor hadn't been uncooperative after the incident. He had been searching for the heartbeat he had worked so hard to protect, only to be dragged away by men who mistook his grief-stricken searching for aggression. "He didn't freeze," Daniela cried out, the letter shaking in her hands. "He stayed. He stayed until they pulled him off and you labeled him a coward because he was too broken to tell you he was just saying goodbye." A heavy silence fell over the hall of service. The handler with the clipboard looked down at his shoes, the not-for-public-sale sign at his feet suddenly looking like a shameful secret. Miller's face had gone pale, his gaze drifting from the little girl to the scarred, hunched dog who was now resting his chin on Daniela's sneaker. The unstable predator was crying, a low, mournful sound that echoed the heartbreak in the letter. But the bureaucratic wheels were already in motion, and as a senior official in a suit stepped out from the shadows of the office, his eyes weren't filled with sympathy, but with the cold calculation of a man worried about a lawsuit. He looked at the heavy-duty leash in the handler's hand and then at the clock on the wall. The time for sentiment was over and the final sleep was only minutes away. The atmosphere in the barn shifted from a somber memorial to a legal battlefield. The official in the sharp suit, Director Holloway, adjusted his tie, his eyes darting toward the few reporters still lingering near the exit. Daniela's reading of the letter had created a ripple of murmurs that threatened to turn into a PR nightmare. He couldn't simply dispose of a dog that the crowd now saw as a guardian of the fallen, but the cold logic of the system still clawed at his mind. "The letter is moving," Holloway conceded, his voice smooth and clinical. "But a letter doesn't change a temperament score. We cannot responsibly adopt out a dog with a red flag designation. It's a matter of public safety." "Then put him on the block," Miller snapped, the sudden edge in his voice surprising everyone. The big officer stepped forward, his boots crunching in the sawdust. "If he's so broken, let the market decide. Put cage 224 on the auction block right now. Let these professionals see what a liability looks like." A tense standoff ensued until Holloway gave a curt, reluctant nod. The auctioneer, sensing a drama that would be talked about for years, climbed back onto his wooden podium. He cleared his throat, but the usual rhythmic high-energy patter was gone. The air was too heavy for it. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer began, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal roof. "We are making a last-minute addition to the catalog. Lot 224. A German Shepherd, male 8 years of age. Retired under exceptional circumstances. The handler reluctantly unlatched the rusted door. The crowd pressed inward, a wall of expensive leather jackets and tactical gear. These were the elite bidders, men who bought dogs for private security firms and high-end estates. They looked at Thor's limp, his scarred shoulder, and his dull coat. To them, this wasn't a hero, it was a bad investment. Thor stepped out of the cage, his paws hitting the sawdust with a soft thud. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He simply walked to Daniela's side and sat down, his heavy head leaning against her denim jacket. He looked small beneath the high-intensity lights, a gray-muzzled ghost among the perfect specimens that had sold for thousands earlier that morning. Opening bid for lot 224, the auctioneer called out, his voice wavering. Do I hear 500? 500 for a veteran of the force. Silence. The men who had been shouting and waving paddles minutes ago suddenly found the floor very interesting. One rancher shook his head, whispering to his companion about rehabilitation costs and unpredictable triggers. 300. The auctioneer tried again, the price dropping with a sickening finality. 300 for Thor? The silence stretched, turning from awkward to agonizing. Daniela looked around at the towering men, her heart sinking as she realized that to these experts, her father's partner was invisible. He was just a number on a crooked tag. The auctioneer raised his gavel, the wood hovering over the block like a guillotine. If there are no bids, the dog will be remanded back to the department for processing. Daniela's hand dove into her pocket, her fingers closing around the single crumpled dollar bill she had been saving since her birthday. She stepped forward, her red sneakers clicking on the wooden floor as she prepared to make the only bid that mattered, unaware that a shadow was moving in the back of the room, and a hand was about to rise that no one expected. The auctioneer's gavel hung in the air, a finality that felt as heavy as a tombstone. Last call for lot 224, he repeated, his voice dropping to a somber murmur. If there is no interest, the lot is closed. $1. The cry was thin, piercing the thick silence of the barn like a lightning strike. Daniela stepped fully into the center of the ring, her small frame silhouetted against the dusty light. She held her hand high, clutching a single crumpled bill, the edges soft from being turned over in her pocket for weeks. It was her entire life savings, a wrinkled piece of paper that looked pathetic against the $1,000 stakes of the morning. A few men in the back chuckled, a low, mocking sound that made Daniela's face flush a deep, burning red. Kid, this is a professional auction, a man in a designer tactical vest called out, a smirk playing on his lips. You can't buy a K9 for the price of a candy bar. The department has minimums to meet. Director Holloway stepped forward, checking his watch with an impatient flick of his wrist. The bid is invalid. It doesn't cover the administrative fees, let alone the insurance bond required for a red flag animal. This isn't a charity, Daniela. It's a legal transfer of state property. Daniela felt the world closing in. The towering men weren't just big. They were a wall of rules and regulations designed to keep things like her away from things like Thor. She looked at Thor, who was watching her with a stillness that was heartbreaking. He knew he was being rejected. He had seen it in the eyes of every handler who had passed his cage for months. He isn't property, Daniela shouted, her voice cracking but refusing to break. She turned to the crowd, her eyes wet but fierce. He's a soldier. If any of you were trapped under a building, would you want a dog that was a good investment? Or would you want the one who stayed until the roof came down? The smirks faded. The rancher who had joked about the dollar looked away, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was heavy with the weight of a guilty conscience. The rules are clear, Holloway said, his voice tightening as he sensed the mood shifting. Without a legitimate, professional bid that meets the reserve, the dog remains department property. Handlers take the leash. A man reached for Thor's collar, but as his hand moved, a shadow detached itself from the back of the room. A heavy, rhythmic thud echoed through the barn, the sound of a prosthetic leg striking the wooden floor. I'll back her bid. The voice belonged to Sergeant Brooks, a man whose face was a map of scars and whose left sleeve was pinned to his chest. He was the one who had trained both John and Thor years ago, a legend who had been forced into a quiet retirement after his own brush with a blast. He walked with a limp that mirrored Thor's, stopping right behind Daniela. He placed a weathered hand on her shoulder, his eyes locking onto Holloway's with a cold, unrelenting stare. The girl's dollar is the only honest money in this room, Brooks growled. I'm signing on as the supervising guardian. I'll put my pension on the line as the bond. Now, Mr. Auctioneer, are you going to take the lady's bid, or are we going to have a conversation about the liability of leaving a hero to rot? The auctioneer looked at Holloway. Holloway looked at the reporters, whose cameras were now aimed directly at the little girl in red sneakers and the crippled war hero standing behind her. The director's face went pale. He knew that if he denied this bid, the morning headlines wouldn't be about public safety, they would be about a department that had lost its heart. The gavel hovered, the room holding its breath as the air grew thick with the scent of sawdust and the electric hum of a turning tide. The barn was so quiet that the faint buzzing of the overhead lights sounded like a swarm of angry hornets. Director Holloway opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat as Sergeant Brooks stepped closer, the weight of his veteran status acting as a physical shield around Daniela. The auctioneer looked between the director and the girl, his gavel hand trembling. "The bid stands at $1, the auctioneer whispered, his voice cracking. "With a veteran co-signer." "Wait," Daniela said. She didn't look at the auctioneer or the director. She looked at the crumpled envelope in her hand. "There's more. You all keep talking about the incident and the failure like you were there. But my dad, he knew you'd say that. He knew how the system works." She pulled the second page from the envelope. This one wasn't a narrative, it was a formal document, stamped with a notary seal from a month before the warehouse blast. The crowd leaned in, a collective breath held in the lungs of every man and woman in the hall of service. Daniela's voice, which had been a trembling reed, suddenly turned into a bell, clear, resonant, and undeniable. "To the Internal Affairs Division and the K-9 Procurement Office," Daniela read, her eyes blazing. "In the event of my incapacitation, I, Officer John Ward, am exercising my right under the Fallen Partner Statute. This dog Thor was not just a department asset. He was legally registered as a dual bond partner. According to the fine print of the 2024 Service Act, a dual bond K-9 cannot be auctioned or euthanized if the surviving family invokes the guardian clause for private retirement." A collective gasp rippled through the officers. Miller's jaw dropped. Holloway reached for the paper, but Brooks stepped in his way, his eyes narrow. "Read the rest, Daniela," Brooks encouraged softly. "It says," Daniela continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a shout, "that Thor was never meant to be here today. My dad knew the department was testing a new AI-integrated K-9 program and wanted to phase out the older, expensive dogs. He discovered that Thor's aggression was actually a response to a specific frequency emitted by the new tactical headsets, a frequency that was causing the dogs to suffer from internal hemorrhaging." The room went ice cold. Bidders looked at each other, their expressions turning from pity to outrage. The unstable behavior wasn't a mental break, it was a physical scream for help. "Thor didn't retreat because he was scared," Daniela said, turning to face Holloway directly. "He retreated to the frequency-shielded zone of the warehouse to lead my dad to safety. And the reason the department labeled him broken wasn't to protect the public. It was to hide the fact that your new equipment was killing your heroes." The shock that hit the room was visceral. The reporters at the back began to whisper frantically into their microphones, and several officers began to murmur, their hands going to their own headsets. The secret in the envelope wasn't just a daughter's plea, it was a whistleblower's final strike from beyond the grave. Holloway's face turned a sickly shade of gray as he realized the broken dog wasn't the only thing about to be exposed in the harsh light of the morning sun. The gavel was still up, the air was thick with the scent of a scandal about to break, and Daniela's father's voice was finally being heard. The air in the barn shifted from a heavy silence to a localized storm. Director Holloway's shock vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. He signaled to two nearby uniformed officers, his hand making a sharp, downward-cutting motion. "The child is in possession of sensitive department documents," he announced, his voice regaining its corporate edge. "That letter contains proprietary technical data and internal safety protocols. It is department property, Daniela. Hand it over and we can discuss the dog's future in a more private setting." The two officers stepped forward, their shadows stretching long over the sawdust. Daniela clutched the letter to her chest, her red sneakers digging into the floorboards. She felt the sudden, massive presence of Thor rising beside her. The dog didn't snarl, but a low, subterranean rumble started in his chest, not the sound of an aggressive beast, but the warning of a guardian who had found his purpose again. "Back off, Miller," Sergeant Brooks snapped, his single arm moving to shield Daniela. "The girl's reading a personal letter from her father. If you want it, you get a warrant. Or are you afraid of what happens when those reporters get a look at the notary stamp?" "This isn't a debate, Sergeant," Holloway barked, his face turning a mottled purple. That document is a breach of security. Hand it over now, or I'll have this entire hall cleared and the dog sedated for immediate transport. We are following protocol. The crowd of bidders, once indifferent, began to roar. The rancher who had joked earlier stood up, his face set in a mask of disgust. Protocol? You're trying to muscle a 10-year-old for a piece of paper. Let the kid speak. The barn erupted into a chorus of shouts, the towering men, turning their fury toward the suited man on the podium. Daniela looked up at Miller, the man who had handed her the flag at the funeral. He was caught between his badge and his heart, his hands twitching near his belt. Sir, Miller whispered, looking at Holloway. The cameras are live. If we touch her, we're the villains in every living room in the state by noon. I don't care about the cameras. Holloway reached over the railing of the auction block, his fingers clawing for the edge of the envelope. That letter is a lie. It's the ramblings of a man who was suffering from post-traumatic stress. But as his hand lunged toward Daniela, Thor moved with a blur of speed that defied his scarred leg. He didn't bite. He simply placed his massive, heavy body between the director and the girl, a wall of fur and muscle that forced Holloway to recoil. The room went dead silent as Thor stood perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on the director with a terrifying, intelligent clarity. He wasn't unstable. He was protecting the only thing his partner had left behind. Daniela stood her ground, the letter held high like a flickering torch in the dim barn. You can't take the truth, she cried out over the rising noise. My dad knew you'd try. That's why this isn't the only copy. Holloway froze, his face drained of color as Daniela looked toward the back of the room, where a woman in a dark trench coat was already holding a smartphone aloft, the red live icon glowing like a warning light. The battle for Thor's life had moved beyond the wooden walls of the barn and into the digital world, and the system was realizing too late that it wasn't fighting a child, it was fighting a ghost who had planned for everything. The tension in the barn was a physical weight, a coiled spring ready to snap. Director Holloway stood frozen, his hand still outstretched, caught in the digital glare of a dozen smartphones. The realization that the private disposal of a liability had become a public execution of his reputation was written in the sweat beading on his forehead. Daniela didn't blink. She stepped forward and placed her crumpled dollar bill directly onto the auctioneer's podium, smoothing it out with a hand that no longer shook. $1, she repeated, her voice echoing into the rafters. The bid is on the table. Accept it or explain to the cameras why a hero's life isn't worth a child's savings. The auctioneer looked at the dollar, then at the director, his hand hovering over the gavel. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic, heavy breathing of Thor at Daniela's side. Just as Holloway opened his mouth to deliver one final bureaucratic killing blow, a heavy set of footsteps sounded from the side entrance. The bid is legally binding. The voice was thin, reedy, and ancient, but it carried a weight that made even Holloway jump. An elderly man in a faded olive-drab dress uniform leaned heavily on a cane as he emerged from the shadows. His chest was a riot of service ribbons, and the silver stars on his shoulders glinted under the flickering fluorescent lights. General Vance? Miller whispered, his hand snapping to a sharp, instinctive salute. The general didn't look at Miller. He looked at the dollar bill. I oversaw the integration of the dual bond statute, he said, his voice gaining strength as he reached the podium. I also oversaw the technical trials of those headsets. Officer Ward reached out to me 3 weeks before the warehouse incident. He sent me the telemetry data from Thor's biometric collar, data that proves the dog was suffering from acute acoustic trauma caused by department equipment. Vance turned his piercing gaze toward Holloway. The department didn't just fail this dog, they sabotaged him. And under the statute, any dog injured by faulty state equipment is entitled to immediate, private discharge to the family of the handler, provided a symbolic bid is made to satisfy the transfer of title. The general reached into his own pocket and pulled out a silver coin, placing it on top of Daniela's dollar. And I'll cover the tax. The room erupted. Bidders who had been silent minutes ago began to cheer, the sound a deafening roar that shook the old wooden beams of the barn. Holloway's face turned a translucent white. He backed away from the podium, his power evaporating like mist in the morning sun. The auctioneer didn't wait for another word from the director. Crack. The gavel slammed down with the force of a thunderbolt. Sold, the auctioneer shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of relief and triumph. To the young lady in the front row. Lot 224 is officially retired. Daniela let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since the day of the funeral. She dropped to her knees, her arms wrapping around Thor's thick neck. The dog let out a long, shuddering sigh, his heavy head sinking into her shoulder. He was no longer a number. He was no longer a liability. He was just Thor, and he was going home. But as the crowd surged forward to celebrate, Sergeant Brooks leaned down, his eyes scanning the barn with a sudden, sharp intensity. "Daniela," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the din, "don't let go of that letter. The general's here, but the men who authorized those headsets are still in the building, and they didn't just lose a dog, they lost $1 billion secret." The gavel's echo still rang in the rafters, but the celebratory roar of the crowd felt strangely distant as Daniela stood up. She felt Thor's fur beneath her fingers, warm, real, and finally hers. But as Sergeant Brooks had warned, the air in the barn hadn't fully cleared. While the bidders cheered, a group of men in dark, unmarked windbreakers moved with surgical precision, blocking the main exits. They weren't auction staff, and they weren't local police. They were the fixers for the tech conglomerate behind the faulty headsets, and their eyes were fixed solely on the crumpled envelope in Daniela's hand. "Stay close to me, Daniela," Brooks muttered, his hand resting on the hilt of a heavy flashlight as he scanned the perimeter. "The front doors are a bottleneck. We're going through the loading bays." The walk felt like an eternity. Daniela squeezed her father's badge in one hand and gripped Thor's lead in the other. Every shadow behind a hay bale seemed to shift. They passed the elite K9s being loaded into expensive trailers, their handlers looking away as if the truth Daniela carried was contagious. The smell of sawdust was replaced by the sharp ozone scent of a brewing storm outside. Near the back bay, a man stepped out from behind a stack of shipping crates. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like an accountant, but the way he held his hand inside his jacket pocket made Thor's ears pin back. "The letter, Daniela," the man said, his voice a calm, terrifying silk. "It's a dangerous thing for a child to carry. It's evidence in an ongoing federal investigation now. You need to hand it over for safekeeping." Thor didn't wait for a command. He didn't lung, but he stepped forward, his body low and his amber eyes glowing with a predatory focus that silenced the man's demand. The broken dog was no longer limping. In the presence of a threat to the girl, Thor's spirit had ignited, overriding the pain in his scarred shoulder. "The only place this letter is going," Brooks growled, stepping into the man's path, "is to the morning news. Now get out of the way before the general decides to make your presence here a matter of military record." The man hesitated, glancing toward the cameras still flashing at the front of the hall. The light was his enemy. He stepped back into the shadows, his expression souring as he realized the secret was already out of the bottle. Daniela reached the heavy metal sliding doors of the loading bay. With a collective effort from Brooks and Miller, who had quietly joined them to provide a final escort, the doors groaned open. The morning sun hit them with a blinding, golden intensity. After the dim, flickering lights of the barn, the world felt impossibly wide and bright. The air was cold, crisp, and smelled of wet earth and freedom. Daniela walked down the ramp, her red sneakers hitting the gravel of the parking lot. Thor walked beside her, his head held high, the dangerous tag long gone. As they reached her mother's waiting car, Daniela looked back at the creaking wooden barn. It was no longer a hall of service or a market of heroes, it was just a building. The real hero was leaning against her leg, his tail giving a slow, steady thump against the car door. They were both broken, and they both carried scars that might never fully fade, but as they drove away from the shadows, the light of the rising sun caught the silver of her father's badge, reflecting a promise kept. The long walk home was over, but as the car pulled onto the main highway, Daniela noticed a black SUV pull out of the fairgrounds lot, following at a distance, reminding her that while Thor was safe, the truth she carried was a flame that would require a much bigger fire to put out. Most people will scroll past this story just like the bidders scrolled past Cage 224. They'll see a broken dog and a grieving girl and decide it's not their problem. But you're still here. You saw Thor's sacrifice and Daniela's courage. If you believe that loyalty shouldn't have a price tag and that no hero should ever be forgotten, don't let their story disappear into the silence. Hit that like button and subscribe to stand with the ones the system tries to ignore. And please comment loyalty below to show Daniela and Thor they aren't standing alone anymore. Don't let the gavel fall on another hero.